is very exciting. The reason it's exciting is as borough president for 8 years and then previously in the city council, and I'll talk to you about the data aspect of that. It's not often that you get to work with such intelligent students doing something that is so fundamentally important to our city. And this god-awful pandemic has shown even more importance for data. The fact of the matter is, I was a city council member for 12 years. And during that time period, toward the end anyway, one of my proudest moments, we did pass paid sick days, and that was a big deal. But the other was to pass the New York City's Open Data law, and it unlocked a treasure of data about streets, crime, restaurant inspections, and other information that came about because of 311. And we're using that. You'll hear more. That's what the discussion is about here. But just to give you a little sense of how hard this was, at the time, I don't think there was any other municipal open data law in the United States. There were some executive orders. And in fact, Bill Clinton had created an executive order when he was president. And the woman who was his CTO at the time, if it wasn't for her, the open data would have never passed. And she and I met. She had a small son at the time who was really small and single mom. And she and I met in coffee shops in order to pull this law off. But now to see that it's being used, I can't tell you how honored I am today to hear about being used by young people. I think everyone on this call knows the importance of data. Sometimes people in the street don't understand that you cannot plan without data. They just want something to happen. You got to have data. It provides vital metrics and measurables. It allows policymakers and government officials to track trends throughout the city, identify problems, hopefully create solutions, and then track the impact of these solutions. I'll talk a little bit about how we're using it for vacant storefronts, which is a huge issue, how we're using it to figure out which religious institutions are, unfortunately, sometimes slated, if they're not landmarked, to come down and become housing, hopefully affordable housing, but it's a big issue, and other topics that are in people's minds, although there's many others. Even the one that I'm thinking of that we've worked on recently, which you wouldn't think of, regarding COVID, the data of our waste. Believe it or not, other countries in the world, particularly in Europe, have been doing this for a while, but basically we have these big sewage treatment plants, and this amazing woman who's in charge of them had really tried and finally got a lab, 3 staff people, and the equipment to be able to analyze our waste, because if in fact COVID is to God knows which strain or which variant to show up, she can know from our waste 6 days in advance. So another example of data. We obviously use it every day. We use it to ensure our community boards reflect their neighborhoods, to map cultural education organizations, connect them with nearby schools, and to track, as I indicated, and I'll talk more about the storefront vacancies. And people say it's terrible. How many vacancies, Gale? Oh, I was out this morning at the subway and people were upset about all the storefront vacancies. But the issue is, find the data, because then we'll know. We did go from the top of the Broadway to the bottom. We walked it and we found a 78% increase during the pandemic from before the pandemic of vacancies. There were already too many. It's like it went from the hundreds to the 300s. But that's just a walk. That's not the owners giving us the data. So we're very focused on data. Also, we're very focused on the technology. Again, this pandemic, I've been talking for years, every student needs an individual device. And nobody listened, because there was this directive that said you have to have a DOE, Department of Education, you have to have a device that is networked, you have to have a device that has a long shelf life, blah, blah, blah. So you have to stick it in the closet with the cart. So we finally won that fight. Now individual students can get individual devices, but guess what? The pandemic came and every student didn't have a device. And we do spend over $35 million every single year, and actually more than that, to try to get smart boards and devices for students, but there's never enough. But the best part of this discussion is partnering with BetaNYC. And that's what you're hearing today. These amazing students are CUNY undergrads. They know all about NYC Open Data, how to analyze it, how to visualize it, with resources like Socrata, BoardStat, Excel, Google Sheets, Carto, ArcGIS, and R. And then when we have all this data, and you'll learn more about how to, as I say, peel back the onion of the data. One example, of course, was to see where there are community board members living, because we want every single aspect of a community board geographical area to be included on membership. And we also we can use that same information to be sure that the community board reflects the demographics of the area. So all of that has been so helpful as we make our appointments. Second, I mentioned earlier, the 196 religious facilities in Manhattan that are not protected by landmark status. And sometimes you'll see a church or a synagogue or a mosque and you'll say, well, that's a beautiful building. And guess what? It's not landmarked. Church can take it down, developer can buy it, but you need to have some sense of how many of them are there, because they're very vulnerable to demolition or development pressure, because a lot of these congregations are very small, the roof leaks, and the developer says, oh, I'll solve your problem. Actually, the AG's office just caught that recently and has hauled in some of the owners. And we're also looking at the hotels. Don't forget, in this awful pandemic, there's not much silver lining, but there are 700 hotels in Manhattan, and maybe, I don't know, not 200 right now have some tourists, some individuals who are homeless, and obviously some with COVID, probably less than that. And the issue is it possible that some of them could go to permanent housing? That's, again, mapping and then what's available. So these amazing scholars from CUNY get involved in all of these projects. They apply their knowledge to real world data challenges that every single NYC employee of government faces. It shows a demand for data analytics and visualization. Now that the available information is on the Open Data portal, thanks to the law that I passed in 2012, it is exciting. I think people see the benefits of this data. You have to, believe it or not, you actually have to convince people that data is important, not you, but people in the community. It's a little frustrating, but you have to do that, because once they see it, they go, I didn't know that was like that. Just to give an example on the vaccines in Washington Heights. So it was the New York Academy of Medicine. They have an amazing map of all the seniors in New York City. Where do they live? Example on the vaccines in Washington Heights. So it was the New York Academy of Medicine. They have an amazing map of all the seniors in New York City. Where do they live? What language do they speak, et cetera, et cetera. So if you go to Washington Heights, 95% of the seniors, and the numbers are all there, prefer Spanish speaking. So if you're doing vaccines, guess what language they should be in? And I won't get into how that took a while. So it is really important to think about this data. And these CUNY fellows, I think we're in our 7th year. Somebody can correct me if I'm not right, but the students who are fellows have gone on to work in major tech roles at Accenture and Google and Citi and Abbott Labs and Epic Software Development. And some of them are doing amazing work in city government, in the city council, Community Board 1, New York State Office of Mental Health, Statistics Department of the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank, and others have gone the academic route. So this year, with this pandemic, shortening the fellows' time with us, we had to change, like everybody else, we had to pivot. That's the verb these days, but they have done so and obviously learned the material, and they've run 9 training sessions during this year's Open Data Week, and they're phenomenal. So it really was an amazing opportunity when we passed the law, but to see it establishing this particular effort, I can't describe it. I really can't describe it. The other, I mentioned storefronts. All we do is walk around and we say, oh my God, there's so many empty storefronts. We did pass Local Law 157, and it is established a vacancy database on our Open Data portal. It was quite some years ago. It was supposed to be published at the end of February. That was last month. But the Department of Finance had to push back the deadline, and it's now going to be October, because the data was collected by last October. So they have the data now, and they're reviewing the release. We hope it'll be in the month of March. And it will include all owners of any, I call it storefront, but anybody who has a commercial lease, 2nd floor and down. So that could be the 1st floor or the basement. That is where that vacancy information for commercial spaces will be available on the Open Data portal. And it has to be an annual Open Data portal. and there'll be fines for owners who don't comply with the law. I just want to be clear that we had a small business task force, and this is not cumbersome information because you are already, as an owner, giving it to the Department of Finance. I was very clear that I didn't want extra burdens on the small owners or the bigger owners, but every single owner we spoke to a lot said this is not a burden. It'll have address level data on the vacant storefronts. It'll have medium and average total duration of leases, the size of rentable floor per each premise, and then the rent will be published at the census tract level. So I think it'll be, and there are other aspects of the bill. You can find it on the City Council's website. It'll also identify vacancy trends throughout the city, spot areas where vacancies are increasing, and identify specific property owners and managers who demonstrate a pattern of forcing out small businesses. Although in this pandemic, I don't know how anybody would do that because you're not likely to get another tenant. In fact, I talked to an owner the other day, could not have been nicer, and he offered he has many retail tenants, but this one was a hairdresser. This is a sad story. So he offered in East Side Manhattan $100 a month. Even that, there were no customers. So the person had to close the business. I'm also hoping that this data will help the businesses, because sometimes they'll see that there's another shop nearby, better location, cheaper rent. So they too hopefully will be helped. Or sometimes the owner says, I want more money for this space. And this will give them the data to be able to find another space in the neighborhood, because so many of these shops, they need their customers like me and you, who I'm a real local shopper. So, that kind of vacancy data, I hope, will also help entrepreneurs who are looking to start a business or expand. The same data supports business owners who are negotiating new leases. So it's both sides. It's a win-win for everybody. It provides, like I said, alternate locations in the same neighborhood with the same customer base, and reduces the business's reliance on staying in the same spot if that's what their concern is and if there's a dispute with the owner. I also just want to close by stating, thanks to Emily, there is an interest, perhaps, if all goes well, in trying to help tenants and owners and the city and the state and the community with working with housing court data to see if we can figure out where some of the evictions are taking place and try to have organizers or others make sure those evictions do not take place. If you could list all the challenges that we face coming out of this pandemic, there are almost too many, but certainly the small stores, the issue of economic development, and housing. Those are just some. There are so many others. It's too long a list. So I can't tell you how honored I am to be here. I want to thank Sarah and Avi for their commitment to this topic, and I hope it's helpful for their careers. And I love CUNY and John Jay College in particular. Thank you very much.